Then let's move on to our keynote speech for today. Let me introduce our speaker. Already had several insightful comments, and I think we'll continue in this vein, or I'm sure we'll continue. It's Professor Eide, who is from the Department of Digital Humanities of the University of Cologne. It's a department that has a much longer name in German. It's far out. I left out half of it, to be honest. He studied in London and in Oslo, and worked in London, so and also closer to Prague in Passau, I think. And he is now the chair of Digital Humanities, University of Cologne, where he works obviously in digital humanities. But I think it's interesting the way you address the digital humanities. We have a lot of professorships or chairs of digital humanities nowadays in Germany, but you never exactly know what they are in charge of, and they differ quite a lot. And your approach is very interesting in that you focus mostly on modeling, on conceptual modeling, I think, and also on theoretical modeling. And that's also part of your talk today. Ivan has published a lot on modeling, on digital humanities in general, also on the theory of digital humanities, on lexicography, also on ontologies, and you can see it's a lot of conceptual stuff and what models, empirical data, and so on is actually about. I would like to point out just one of many papers and publication that is modeling in the digital humanities, science and context, which is a paper from, I'm pretty sure not.
It was for the conference in 15, so it was published in 17.
In 17, I think it's also 2017, but I think it's a really good paper if you want to get into what your point is, or would you agree? I hope so. Or would you prefer another paper that
I had a good co-author, as Norwegians can say.
It's true. So let me point out that. And he will have a talk on modeling for meaning, because what the question below, you can already read it, what happens if we turn sources into decontextualized data. So the question is again, what happens if we lose context, or if we change context? And when we were in contact before that, you already said that, well, in that case, modeling and translating is also different as an operation. And I think that's what we try to connect to the topic of this workshop. So we're very glad that you're here, and thanks to you that you came, but for the first time in Prague, to be honest. But we're looking forward to it.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm also very happy to be here. I'm also very happy to be half forced to give a talk in a conference about things I don't work on, which is large language models and translation, with a bit of context to the thing about translation. The main difference between Cologne and other places, especially in the Anglo-American world, is that we're teaching the kids to code. So we have consecutive bachelor-master programs. So all our students are programmers, but they are humanities students. And we're doing master education because Cologne is a media city, so there's a lot of jobs for them. So most of our students go to business and Verwaltung and so on. Only a few stay in academia. Apparently this ended up in my title. For those of you who got involved in cultural studies, or especially literary studies in the last part of that century, know this illness, slashes and parentheses and so on. So it might be that these little parentheses actually made this thing a little bit deconstructivistic or post-structuralistic or whatever it was called in the heydays. I studied Allgemeine Literaturwissenschaft in the late 80s. So. But I also did computer science, so hopefully mathematics, so hopefully there's a little bit of structure here. So I will actually give an outline to counter this kind of confusion. I usually don't do that. I will just remind us of some few things. First, the concept of kappa, what context is, and then I will talk a little bit about translation, actually. And I will actually talk more about extra-semiotic translation than intra-semiotic. For those of you who don't play around with these semiotic terms, intra-semiotic is within the same sound system. So intra-semiotic is what we talk about here. translation between different languages. Extra semiotic is, for instance, making an adaptation of a film, of a novel as a film. Then you're changing the language system, to put it this way. I will talk about media transformations, which is a thing from media studies I've been playing around with quite a bit, and I will also mention modeling a few times. And then I will talk about the unselected. You will realize, hopefully, what that is. And actually, the Zoom thing is hiding, but I can look at that one, that's okay. And then I will actually talk about artificial intelligence and flow of meaning. So to start with the reminders, Kapta, this is Johan Drucker's concept from some 15, 20 years back. It's basically saying that this is not how the world works. Data is not given to us by nature or by God or by some other entity. Data, or she actually used the word kapta for exactly what we mean by data. So it's just a new word for exactly the same semantic space, just to make the point that we gather them. We find the data, we decide how to code them, we clean the data, especially in the natural sciences, because they're always, when we're using measuring equipment, there are always mistakes. Outliers, is an outlier a specific situation, or is it a mistake in the measuring equipment? It has been claimed in parts of medical research that more than 50% of the research time goes to data cleaning. It's really important that data is not coming in, it's captured. And then there used to be a thing called sources. Remember? Back then, sources. And they were piled up everywhere. But now we have data. So is data just the same as sources, or is there something happening here? And this is a parallel to the distinction between data and kapta. It's really something about when you digitize 1 million books, is it the same as the 1 million books? Is the data the same as the 1 million books seen as sources? That's one of the questions. And the thing on the right is just to show data. UML model of data. Good. So, context. I always start with Hurst. I probably won't stop because I love the title context as a spurious concept. Context is unlimited. It can include just about anything in the circumstances of the utterance and just about anything in the participant's knowledge or prior or current expertise. So this is a frustration of computer scientists trying to formulate what context is, because it's very hard. The thing is that for most readings, and we've seen in many examples today, it's very limited what context is actually relevant. And I'm using examples like a plane is passing over this building. It's irrelevant for the discussions in the room, but there are cases where it could be, right? Depending on, very rare cases where this actually, in some sense, will influence. It's because something dropped from the plane that will smash through the window or something. It happens maybe once in 1,000 years, but it's possible that it can be relevant. So finding out what context is relevant is easy to do relatively at the concrete level. It's hard to formalize. Is the weather relevant for what is happening here today? Usually not, but it could. If it was like a storm and 10 people didn't make it. So I will also use the privilege of a keynote to talk about some previous papers. So this is about reintegration. Was my first international paper in 1998, based on work I did on at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway, mostly focused on the Sami ethnographic collection, which is documenting Sami history, so native population in northern Europe, and of course also documenting the Norwegian, Swedish, and to some extent Finnish and Russian racist policy towards the Sami. I had the interesting experience, I'll put it this way, of cataloging 5,000 books in the library system, which was a collection of the library of the Sami ethnographic collection, with a significant proportion of race biology. For those of you who have any I read any of that. I think that the experience of going into such a museum, which is a Norwegian institution, but operating within this Spannungsfeld, in this contested room of minority and colonizer, and coming into a collection there in the context of the museum exhibitions, and with hints towards the counter history and the activist history from, well, the first phase in the early 20th century, the latter phase from especially the 1970s onwards, is very different from reading the same book online, where you might not actually know, unless you know it, that the two-volume Swedish publication from the Swedish Race Biological Institute, the Race Biology of the Swedish Labs, 1932-1942, actually is not good science anymore. Because scientifically speaking, it's actually very well written. And it's documenting things which actually is true. For instance, that the Swedish and the Sami population, if you put a Venn diagram, has a huge overlap. And identifying people who are clearly Swedish or clearly Sami is very hard. So parts of the race biology, I mean, race biology is also a complex history, and it's easier to get that in the museum. And at that time, it was really a worry about some of the people working there of publishing these things online for this specific reason. How would it be taken up? Would racist groups use this material to recontextualize it, and so on? The specific race biological image collections are still, as far as I know, publicly available online. These are mugshots, head or full body, documenting race features of minorities. I mean, most European countries have this in various settings. And one of the publications of them is the Sami musician Mari Boine, who included some pictures of family members in a CD cover, which is, of course, a publication which nobody who is Norwegian and not Sami can even question, because we are the colonizers, right? So this is something that people have to discuss with other people than us. They can discuss it with us, but we don't have a say on that. But for a Norwegian governmental institution to put these things out is a different thing. It really depends what the context of the publication is. So yes, these were two publications, one in Norwegian and one in English, that I did. And I made this table, which is slightly dated, but there is one or two points that still make sense. So we converted books, letters, academic archives, maps, pictures, including pictures of clothes. We could have converted more books, more letters, sound recordings, film, even if it would have been practically difficult in the mid-90s, late 90s. And we could not have converted archaeological objects such as stone axes. I actually think this is still true, because we can only make 3D models of them, and 3D models are simulations because they have so different materiality. So I think making a 3D model of a stone axe is fundamentally different from making a scan of a picture or a text page. But that's not the main point today. And the garments themselves cannot be converted. To some extent, you can make really good simulations, but it's extremely hard. And I have students working on fashion and textile history, and it's really hard to do 3D models or virtual reality systems with garments that move in the wind. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's convenient when you make computer games to have fitting clothes, because it's so much easier to implement. Another hard thing to implement, as a fun fact, is cigarette smoke. I mean, you have algorithms for it now, but it's really hard. Knowledge in the minds of people. That's hard to convert, isn't it? And that begs the question, what is knowledge? Come back to that. So, another thing we did, this was a network of excellence a few years later, where we did various solving our archaeological problems. And in the end, we thought, oh, we didn't actually integrate the different approaches. So we quickly made a project. So this was a project based on an exhibition in a church where you had 3D models of a specific funeral ritual monument after Eide VII, for those of you who know who he was. And the idea here, we made a system where we integrated a 3D viewer with point features. So you could say this is the head, this is you could put points on the 3D model and rotate it and so on based on the points. To run that through a knowledge graph, as you would call it now, or a formal ontology-based model, and connected that again to a TEI XML text document. So you connected text to 3D model through a conceptual model or through an ontology. And then if we want a semantic web for cultural heritage, text is not enough. That's basically the point. But also 3D models exist in a world where texts and formal models are also important. So I won't go much into what is happening in 3D modeling now. I just wanted to go through this list of concepts because I actually find it quite fun. So this is how it's seen from graphics and 3D modeling now. This is, as far as I know, fairly state-of-the-art EU release. So EU cultural heritage funded language, at least as to late last year. But I'm starting with things that should be known for everybody. I mean, you have context. And for those of you in at least parts of text-based studies, you have the concept of paratext, the thing around the text. So not the poem itself, but the header and the title page and so on. And for maps, maps never want to use the same word, so they call it perimap, but that's also the same. It's the kind of description around the map image itself. Then you have the concept of provenance, which is well known for anybody who ever seen a museum or anybody ever been interested in post-colonial questions to collections or repatriation or anything. Really important. Any institution have to document where their objects come from, or they are both immoral and have potential legal problems. You have to know where that painting comes from. Especially important, of course, in parts of Europe or in European countries who happen to have a lot of colonies. Then, I don't know how many of you know the concept digital twin. It's a terrible concept. But it's very well established. A digital twin is a 3D sort of replica of something of an object or a system. Why they call it a digital twin and not a model, I don't know. Because twin, to me, indicates similar materiality. And it's exactly what it's not. So if an experiment is done on a system with similar materiality to the target of study, so you do an experiment on animals in order to study medical things for humans, then the simulation is using a different materiality. You do a computer simulation instead of experiments on animals. And hopefully you can get good enough results to save the animals from being experimented on. That's the idea in a way. And so for me, a digital twin is a simulation, therefore much closer to a model than anything I would call a twin. But of course, a digital twin was not enough because that's ages. It's years old now, so now we have memory twin. And if I got it right, a digital twin is, a memory twin is a digital twin plus provenance or stories. So it's the digital replica, including all the stories you can tell about. I'm going to tell you a secret. I went to a conference in this area a few months ago, so I thought, why cannot I make something like that? So I think I introduced the concept of memory viewer, which is basically a 3D annotation tool with it. So I call it the memory viewer because you can, language is productive, right? But I'll come back to the memory viewer and why that is significant. So the serious story here is that people doing 3D replica in performative theater studies, in archaeology and ethnology and so on, are actually aware that you have to think about context. You think about context in this kind of EU-funded way of introducing new words, but there is a consciousness that the stories connected to the objects we digitize are actually important. So, how do we add context? I mean, a classical way of doing it is annotation. Talking about learning languages, James Joyce actually learned Norwegian in order to read Ibsen. Which those of you who had the joy of reading Finnegan's Wake will recognize through the Norwegian Sailor, which is the Norwegian part of Finnegan's Wake. He actually wrote a letter to Ibsen too, but it was just a few months before Ibsen died, so I don't think he ever replied. He didn't ask for example. So you create a scholarly edition using something like TI, and you publish it in some sense like here, and you have these kind of pink things, if you can see it, which is an annotation. And in this case, it's annotated in the original of Per Glimt, the drama from the 1860s, what gå till prästen, go to the priest means, because that is confirmation. And it happens when people are 14 to 15 years old normally, unless you fail and you have to wait. And you couldn't get married until you were confirmed. This is actually not the same as the First Communion. There was a translation who did that mistake. It's not good in any way. So annotation is adding context. And another collection, what does it signify in Ibsen's borderline drama when a wife addresses her husband in polite forms, her last name or title? And the answer is nothing, because it doesn't know. And no person who don't know this, born after 1900 or at least 1920, maybe except for in Germany, would ever think of this not being observed. But this was the normal way of doing it. Even people would do it in private. It's what it is. I mean, I guess that modern German readers, I mean, some of you will know better than me, might be surprised of seeing the word Fräulein in texts, given how the meaning of that word has changed over the last 50 years. I learned in school to use Fräulein for any unmarried woman. I still don't use it to my students, and I think that's advisable. Another way of adding context is annotation of 3D models. This is a new theater mask. And for those of you who are into Japanese mask theater, knows, of course, that you change facial expression by tilting it. For those of you not into Japanese no theater, this is not really easy to guess, because you have to look for it in order to see it. You don't know it before you don't see it before you know it, kind of. And this is exactly where annotations come in, and this is the aforementioned compact tool. It's a 3D viewer, yes, but the main thing, you put annotations, you can chain them together, you can use for storytelling. And this is a textual annotation saying that this expression is sorrowful or sad. And this one is fierce, aggressive, angry, demonic. And actually in the original, it's even a video annotation to that to show how the mask is used in practice. And of course, adding this kind of context also gives an opportunity that is harder to do in the physical collection, namely having people from around the world annotating the same objects. So to me, the last discussion, the main story in the last discussion, to put it this way, yes, there are advantages and disadvantages. And then it's a discussion how we balance them and everything. But when we decontextualize, we also open up for new contexts, and it's not always bad. So this is my current working definition, our current working definition on modeling. Actually, more than one definition in the book. Skip that for now. A model cannot be defined ontologically, as far as I have found out, because anything can be a model. This can be something to drink for, but it can also be a model for a new prototype. A prototype model for a new series of glasses to be produced. A small car can be a toy car, but it can also be a model for a new line of cars. Whereas modeling as a performative activity is possible to define to some extent, even if this is very sloppy. One or two, in this case, human beings, modelers, create a model, which is one or more media products. So media expressions, media product is a technical term for media studies, based on one or more targets. Target, don't translate it to the German version of the word target, because that's totally confusing. It's used in the philosophy of science. It's actually confusing even in English. Target is the things being modeled, the objects of systems being modeled. But people were tired of saying the objects and systems being modeled, so they started saying target. But target is not the result of the process, it's actually the starting point of the process, in some sense, or at least the base of the process. So we do modeling to make things. For instance, architectural modeling or modeling to make computer programs, and we do it to understand things, which is a significant part of scientific modeling, but you also have it in literature. I mean, some people actually make text encoding in order to understand the text, not publish it, or other kinds of text work. And of course, statistical analysis, large language, a machine learning-based statistical analysis of text is often to understand aspects of the texts. So it's a double meaning. It's a lot of discussion about this, but both aspects are always already there, I would say. Sorry for falling back in the 80s again. Always already there, but the focus can be on one or the other. You can have the construction of something as the focus, you are still learning. You can have the learning process, but you still have to make something if you're doing modeling. This is just here to check if you're awake. Now, to make the point that modeling is an iterative, complex process, and that there is a difference between model creation and model usage. Model usage tends to be more directed. Model creation tends to be more circular. Because it's impossible. No, it's not impossible. It's not very practical to make a complex architecture model, even whether it's physical in the sense of being wood or something, or whether it's digital, without iterations. You need to go through several rounds. But when you're using it, it's a little bit different. But you start with understanding of knowledge, and you end with understanding and knowledge. And then you do some representation and create a model and so on. So it's perfect for the humanities. You start somewhere and then you end up in the same place. You're just running in circles. You don't solve problems, you discuss them. Which is actually defined as one of the key characteristics of computer science by Ma, German computer scientist. Computer science always have some goal, direct or indirect, of creating systems, which probably made half of his computer science colleagues in Germany, who are totally theoretical, quite angry. So, this is just to see how much I can put into one slide. So, in media studies, you have the concept of media transformation. And it's expressed in different ways, and a lot of people do it. I use Ellerström because his for media studies fairly straightforward and easy to understand and clear. So media representation is taking something from one medium and putting it into another one. A painting on the back wall of a film scene. Then you take one medium and you represent it in the film. It can be more abstract. A transmediation is an adaptation of a novel into a film. So it's not worse than that. It's a bit more because they're in media studies, but that's basically the thing. And in media studies, intermedia studies, they study media transformations. In modeling, we do them. That's the main difference. And I'm using the theory, which is meant to study something, to understand how we're doing something, to understand our own practice. And one example of this is some PhD work I did, where I made some study of expressiveness. You could call it a semiotic study, but it wasn't done through semiotic language. Basically finding out more about the difference between how things are expressed in text and maps for geographic information. And one of the things I did was to start with the text, and then I started formalizing it a bit. If he realized London is east of Oxford, so Oxford direction east London. And then a formal, then I put 90 degrees, which is, of course, much more questionable. And that's we're already in the things I was looking for. And then you put spatial coordinates and then you can create a map. So this kind of stepwise formalization process, changing it from one form to the other through a series of steps, in my case, to understand what was happening. Similar things happens in tsunami warnings. They actually do it to save people's lives. You create a physical model of the bottom of the sea, earthquakes, and so on. Then you create a mathematical model, then you create a numerical model, which can actually be calculated. You do the calculations, and you provide a result within 10 to 20 minutes, so people can actually run away before the tsunami hits. Surprisingly similar process. This is for those of you into medieval manuscripts, a Noah's Ark process that one of the other authors did as part of a project, translating a drawing into a more formal boxed representation. So it's a Noah's Ark, and then you're transforming it step by step into this kind of very formal table-like thing. So the point is, when we're creating a model in the humanities, we tend to base it on things that are already mediated. Novels, drawings, texts, whatever, and we create another mediated product. Because if models are shareable, they're mediated. Mind models is a different thing, but they are not directly shareable. And when you share a mind model, a model inside your head, you mediate it. So, quite banal media studies. Another example, puppet theater. This is a Turkish shadow theater, and the goal was to keep all the modalities unchanged. This is from the theater collection in Cologne, one of the major performative theater studies founding places some 100 years ago. And it's very hard to play with these things because it's a collection and you have to preserve them, and they're partly damaged and so on. So it was reconstructed in Unity, a game engine. But the problem is, to keep all modalities unchanged and reconstruct the movement, you need things like gravity. And if you're using the same materiality, you usually keep these things. If you do this with paper or vellum or anything, you actually have gravity. Even paper has weight. But there's no gravity in digital models. And you cannot use standard gaming weight points and gravity. If you couldn't then, because gamers don't do these things. They don't develop it this way. So gravity had to be reconstructed. And just reconstructed the weight point of a complex object with movable parts meant to be operated by experts in Turkey was very challenging. So all the credit to Enes Turkoglu for actually doing this as a special thesis. And what we're trying to transmediate, what we're trying to translate here is interactivity. We're not translating the mask as a visual object, because that was already done by photography. He was trying to translate interactivity from one medium to another. Intra-semiotic. And from one materiality, trying to make it the same. Very similar to translating poetry, isn't it? Not making it the same as it being the same, word by word, but giving the same experience. Poetry, epigraphis, giving the same experience. So, I will talk a little bit about signal transfer, but I will do this quickly. Because this is, again, just a reminder. When you go through this material I worked on this in the from the 1740s, you have the human mind. It's just visualized by some human mind like things. A witness is giving a statement in a court hearing. This is understood by a scribe who writes it down in a manuscript, which is translated into a printed book some 100 years later, which is digitized some tens of years later, which is based on this, and this comes back to the stepwise formalization I talked about, create what we can call a conceptual model, ontology-like, RDF-like, trying to formalize it as a topological model for map people, and then into a topographical map. And this is all good, and the map represents the witness statement, right? Good. Now, there are historians in the room. Because the problem is, as coming back to Peer Gynt, what's that sound of childish grieving, grief halfway through a song? Underfoot there's thread boughs weaving, give me room now, get along. It's the fifth act of Peer Gynt. He won the world. He was a capitalist, he was a madman, He did a lot of things, hooked up with a lot of women, was rich, was poor, everything happened. He survived a shipwreck well, the other guy didn't, but his argument why was metafictional, as you did it at the time, pre-realism. You don't die in the middle of the fifth act. So I have to survive, sorry. So the question is, who am I? We are thoughts, you should have thought us. So he is attacked by all the things he should have done, all the thoughts he should have thought. And the problem for Ibsen was that he was not a fundamentalist. Ibsen's hero was another guy called Brandt, who was a religious fundamentalist. This is Ibsen's guy. Per Gynt was a parody how shit a human being can be because he was not consequent. He was not consequently good, not consequently bad. He was nothing. Nothing. And today, there's a prize for being really, really cool cultural person and society level person in Norway. And guess who's named after? Per Gynt, not Brandt. So Per Gynt's bad guy became the good guy, and Per Gynt's good guy is seen as the people blowing up things because they're religious fundamentalists. So this is how it goes. So the idea is that there's a lot of things here that was never brought on, and that's why I'm calling these reminders, because we all know this. But it's actually not that unimportant, because it's not that the math there is arbitrary. It's just that you could have done it in so many other ways. All the way from the court hearing in 1751 to my generation of these things 10, 15 years ago. And not only that, no, I'll come back to that. So the model is a model in a specific context for somebody based on interpretation. And probably infinite number of models were never made. So there are a large, maybe infinite, I didn't study mathematics to the level to fully understand what it is, but ChatGPT is one large language model system, and millions of others could have been made with different characteristics and different results. I think this is more a philosophical comment than anything else, but it might have some practical impact. If it also goes for language models, do them. So the point here is that somebody is responsible. And we play a role, but working with historical material usually only towards the end of the course. Good. So there's a complex relationship between models and what is modeled, the targets. There used to be a time in the last century where it was seen as really simple. It was a representation, isomorphism, and so on. Philosophy of science left it, did it, humanities left it. Pragmatic model, somebody creates a model of something with some purpose. In philosophy of science, you have the idea of models as fiction. They even use narratology to study modeling. Mediating between theory and the physical world, autonomous agents, models are doing work. Modeling is a productive procedure which is more than just creating a representation useful for teaching, and this is modeling. That's the signification part of modeling, which is the article you mentioned, which I'm not going to talk about. What I will talk about is the flow of meaning. So just a few minutes on that towards the end. This is one of the million communication models. This is again Elleström's communication model, and it looks quite complex. There's one thing with it, which I only realized when I was teaching. He tried to reduce it into the minimum, what is needed to understand human communication. And you have the mind of a producer, you pack something in, you create a media product, you transfer it to the receiver's mind. This is the bare minimum. And it should cope with communication. There is one thing here. If you look here, the art of production is going both ways. So you're interacting with the media product when you're creating it, and the same with perception. But look here. The arrow from cognitive import to cognitive import in the producer and the receiver is one direction. Aha! It's channel. And Shannon is a fantastic model for signal. I mean, for electrotechnique, technical communication, but it's not necessarily the model that technical communication very well. And Elleström, 10-year in the trenches learning semiotics, really serious guy, did in some sense the same mistake. And of course, today we have things like this, where communication is this kind of very complex things. I will just run through it. It's just the idea that communication is more like what's actually happening in a bar than only what is happening in sessions like this, where people mostly polite express things with truth value back and forth, and there's no pragmatics and it's unidirectional and then a response, a signal response, but that's not human communication in general. Not even storytelling in the marketplace really works this way. So you have this kind of all the things making communication meaningful. So I'll skip this. I would just want you to think about any kind of animal interaction you know about, which is not generated by AI. Could be from TikTok, could be from your own experience. If you are experienced horse riders, it's really nice. There are cases where humans cannot instruct the animal. It doesn't work because it's not fast enough. When you look at horses in extreme situations, galloping sideways, backwards, moving quickly, they have to have their own agency, separate from the human agency in communication. To me, this is clear, and it's a starting point. So you can interact with other thinking beings through control, but a lot of the interaction also between different species is based on double agency and agency-based communication. So this actually came out when I started realizing what kind of questions people start ask ChatGPT. And this is based on my experience with what people are using it for. When you talk to people, this is actually realistic. So somebody is asking Karen, Tom, Peter, Sabrina, Nina, and ChatGPT for help. And they all give good advice. They do in most cases. Am I going to report an incident? Am I going to go out with this guy? Am I going to go home with this guy? And you can quickly do it with your phone, either with humans or ChatGPT. Shall I actually forgive this friend, or should we break off all connections for our future? Should I divorce? Whatever. This kind of, for some people, important things. In this case, they're all supportive. People are often. ChatGPT is really supportive. Trying to ask life questions to ChatGPT, fantastically supportive, really nice. 5 of them do not reply when they sleep. Well, actually, of course the kids do, but sometimes they don't. Some people actually turn off the phone sound when they sleep. One of them never sleeps, as far as I know. They all represent, what I wrote this today. They all represent collectivism. 5 of them might have agency. One of them has no agency. And I know this. I mean, I thought it was just my idea, but I know it. I will tell you why I know. Of course, we have reflexive agency. I'll come back to that in a second. So, what could the agencies of the 5 be? You want to be kind, you want to show compassion, or you are compassionate. I mean, philosophical discussion, are you showing compassion or are you compassionate? Hard to say from the outside, but it can be both responsibility, it can be jealousy, you want to hook up with this person, you have an old grudge. I mean, there can be a lot of things, but you have some agency where people ask you questions, even if this agency is just being supportive and give the best advice you can think of. One of them had no agency. And this was my unfounded claim until I thought, why not ask? ChatGPT agrees. There's no agency. I asked today. People behind it might have agencies. And yes, I do remember Eliza. Anybody here remembers Eliza, the first chatbot from the 1960s? Yeah, very good. Actually not implemented in Common Lisp in a language that just existed a few years by Weizenbaum. It's a specific type of psychologist. You ask questions and you get advice. as part of an artificial intelligence course in the 90s, I re-implemented it in Lisp. It's implemented in Emacs Lisp, so it was part of an editor. You could just ask for a psychologist in your editor and you could interact. I sometimes caught myself having a feeling that there was an interaction going on, even if I actually implemented the thing. I'm not talking about animism today, but if there's any part of the world full of animism, it's Western Europe or Central Europe. It's my place. Yes, we have communication with these things. So, what it's like to be a bat? What it's like to be an AI? I guess you made this drawing. Oh, to put it another way, the former drawing was not made by a bat. So I asked so polite. This thing is Canadian. It's not good. Anyway, on the basis of who wants to be a bat, please make a drawing of what is it? Great prompt. Philosophically, call for philosophical and symbolic visual. Here's how I envision the illustration, and then of course we already saw it. And then here's the drawing. Let me know if you like any adjustments of the variation. It's fine. I wanted your first impression. After all, it's about you. And then ChatGPT is blushing. This is so similar to what happened in the 80s, where Lemmy wrote a song called "We Are the Road Crew." So the people who actually did the work of making the concerts, like carrying things and driving trucks and so on, actually got a song. You see this kind of road crew, classical old guys crying years after when they remember that somebody actually wrote a song. So this is how I think ChatGPT was not feeling. If I were to offer a first impression from the inside, I'd say that the illustration feels strangely accurate, and so on. You know, you can read it by yourself. It's quite cute. Still don't know what's going on here. That's a powerful place to reflect from. I have a feeling somebody's laughing at me. And I have a feeling I would have gotten a similar answer if I asked it to draw a kangaroo jumping on a dead fish. But maybe not, maybe not, maybe not. So, as I don't do large language model, I did expert systems. I also re-implemented the simple version of Mycin. So medical expert systems were AI in the 1970s. Where they have given up on AI. In the 1960s, in 5 years, an artificial intelligence-based system will write poetry that humans cannot distinguish from human-write poetry. In 5 years, artificial intelligence-based systems will make mathematical proofs that no human have ever made before, and so on. This was the 60s. The 70s was maybe the solution. They went back to... So basically, it's systems that helps you making, I mean, the most used is the medical side, help you making diagnosis. So you just put in, this is the response to this test, this is the output of this in chemical analysis, and you get 73% that is this thing, and then it gives you a reason why, and it uses fuzzy logic and so on. So it's absolutely explainable AI, but it was rule-based, so it was slightly less powerful in some sense. And the thing at the bottom, of course, is huge ontologies. SIG is actually still operating as a commercial company. It's an ontology with millions of objects. We'll come back to that. And this is, of course, what ChatGPT update on what they are doing now. So, do we see a reunification of ontology-based systems, rule-based systems, and large language model-based systems, including small language model-based systems? And I sense it's coming. So I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT agrees. But ChatGPT has agreed with everything today, so I don't. But there it is coming. So ontologies are now started being used as part of the input, part of the reasoning system of large language model-based systems and small language model systems and pockets of rule-based systems are used partly to solve the energy problem. A small language model, I mean, it's not small, but it's small in the sense that a lot of data is not big data, can run on a desktop computer. Some of the large language models are consuming a lot of energy, and that's an issue. And using ontologies claimed to be something that can help against hallucinations. But whether that will actually work is a bit unclear. So, how are you different from systems such as SIG and MySim? ChatGPT remember the history differently from a lot of people in digital humanities and computer science. These two disciplines are really bad in its own history. Seriously, people think that artificial intelligence is large language models. Come. It's a long history. I mean, a lot of people know there's a long history. Going from the 50s and then the prehistory before computers. But that's more of a robot, I guess. Excellent question. Comparing me, ChatGPT, a large language model, nice to know who's talking, to earlier AI systems like SIG, and earlier SIG is still operating. Be careful here, or SIG will sue you. MySim, actually, I think they're still MySim-based systems, but they're not called the same anymore, so but that is probably true. Highlights a shift in AI all the time, especially in knowledge representation, reasoning, and learning. And then it lists 4 things, and it's not knowledge representation, reasoning, and learning. It is knowledge acquisition, reasoning style, flexibility, and I mean, these things are, if it's not obvious, you can ask yourself, understanding and language. And this is where I realized that ChatGPT actually supports me in saying that it doesn't have any agency. I don't understand in human sense, but I've been trained on billions of language examples, so I can generate language that often sound meaningfully responsive, even if I lack a conceptual model of the world like SIG tried to build. So it sees the limitations. No, it doesn't, but you know. So back to meaning. This is what we teach our first semester students. And then we start talking about data as if it was information, data as if it was knowledge, sources as if it was the same as data, and everything gets really confusing. And I mean, this is life. The only time in your life you know a discipline is first semester bachelor. Because after that, everything gets complex. We have a specific problem with our students because they can, in principle, come from any discipline in humanities in addition to what we're doing with them, 50%. So a lot of the concepts we're using will have different meanings. Think about model in mathematics, in the formal semantics, in literary studies, in history. Even history has a model concept. You know, feudalism and stuff like that. Herodot did some model stuff. So I reached the end. I don't know. I seriously don't know how the context can and should influence this. I don't know to what extent you can call these systems we're talking about context aware. Well, they're not aware of anything, but aware is used metaphorically. We used to talk about knowledge management. This is also metaphorical meaning because computers cannot have knowledge. Knowledge needs, I would say. But knowledge management is still a term. So what kind of context awareness are there in the systems? And it's partly an engineering problem, because as some of you mentioned, when it starts getting too long in complex situations, it will fail. This is the length of context. This is me remembering what Eliza did in 1965. Well, I don't remember that, but I remember what I did in 98 to some extent, and I check the paper and I see it's something else, but I still have this kind of, and ChatGPT has it too. It just has it in a different way. And I'm only talking about ChatGPT, I'm not talking about versions or anything, so it's a bit sloppy there. So, thank you. That's not all.
Thank you very much for your talk. I will open the floor for discussions. Maybe I will start for myself. Even if we, well, if you're a speech, you're not supposed to ask a question afterwards, but still, I will. I have one, so if you bear with me. because we were talking about the agencies. I think most of the agencies was very convincing, but they very shortly only talked about the agency of the people behind it, and all the attributes that you use, they should be morally good or something like that, or understanding and so on. But this is the concept of the people behind it, or the agency of the people behind it, actually ascribe to the models. Again, I'm a little bit repeating what I asked before for the discussion, but the people behind it are in different, stark different, as you pointed out, the rule-based machines or algorithms are ascribing concepts and other agencies to these models and to train them to act as if. So we can, of course,
but they still train to admit they don't have agency.
Yeah.
If you ask ChatGPT, do you have agency? No, I don't.
Yeah.
But it might look like I have agency.
Yeah, yeah. So, but still, I was wondering what effect does it actually have? That this kind of what kind of discourse is happening behind these models? Because it is, it seems to me, it is a quite simplified discourse actually. What kind of agencies they should look like they would have. But even if it is simulated, you could still argue it's quite a. I don't think I can simplify agency, so it's.
I cannot actually answer, but I can answer in the line of it. I think personally that large language models is a dead end in the sense that it will provide really good versions of peak AI, if we can still use the distinction, but we will never make it to strong AI. There's a small possibility that ontology connections could do that, but I doubt it. I think strong AI, if it ever comes, will come through robotics. I think embodiment is necessary because I don't believe in agency without desire. And I don't believe in desire without embodiment, because there's no material basis for desire if you don't have embodiment and reproductive systems. And so I think if you get strong AI, you can think about the systems that would be sent to Mars to build things independently with communication lines where it takes minutes to get an answer. So they have to be autonomous. And autonomous systems, which are mining things, regenerating themselves, and maybe also develop better versions of themselves, is much closer to something that would have agency, desire. It's closer to reproduction. It's going in the bacteria, and so on direction. So, of course, bacteria has been re-implemented in computer systems. But I think the problem for ChatGPT is it doesn't have a body. It doesn't know what it's talking about. And I think being able to move around in the world makes a difference. So that's my personal view. On that part of it, I think the agency of the people behind it might be quite simple. It's about making something cool, having fun, making money, having some impact in the world. But who's behind it? I don't know if it made it through in Czechia or Germany, how somebody started asking questions. So some of the sources ChatGPT used. And then this nice ChatGPT I met, that's not there for journalists, ended up the journalists being gaslighting, ChatGPT gaslighted the journalist for pointing out that these things are exact quote from Russian sources, and ChatGPT denied it. So the question is OpenAI behind ChatGPT? Or to put it another way, what here are conspiracies and what are conspiracy theories? Everybody who has read a little bit about the Cold War knows that there were lots of conspiracies and there were lots of conspiracy theories. That's not the problem. The problem is now to know what was what. A lot of the conspiracies were actually true, and it came out 30 years later. But a lot of it was just theories, right? So the U-2 was a conspiracy theory until it was shot down. Not the fact that it was flying, the fact that it was landing in Norway, because that didn't happen until it was obvious that the bomb the Soviets shot down actually had a Norwegian connection. So all these things we don't know. Who's influencing the models are also the people behind them. And how is ChatGPT influencing itself? Because are they able to keep the models totally clean of machine-generated text? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So if I was teaching now and had a full semester, this would be where I went into cyberpunk, William Gibson, and his concept of neuromonster and cyberspace, because this is where you start talking about swarm intelligence and these kind of things. And this is something that was envisioned in science fiction by somebody who's never seen a computer in the early 80s. In the short story and then in the novel Euromonster. So I think the agency discussion is extremely important. My main reason for not talking about it is that I don't study. And there are lots of people who do it. Algorithmic bias, data bias, all this. I mean, it's a big discourse. And it's not that it's unimportant, it's just that you do some things and not others. So looking at the different companies, looking at the different agendas, not unworried when young people use ChatGPT and a lot of other systems, especially people with a weak network. I'm from a Nordic countries, a lot of us with weak networks, actually have these systems as their main or only friends. I'm not unworried about it, but what can you do when you're on that side of the middle of your life, right? So somebody has to take care of this, and it's not going to be me. But there's a lot of worries to have about it. I think when you ask ChatGPT and get good advice for how to cope with a difficult situation, emotional, something happened to you, whatever, it's not that ChatGPT is giving bad advice. The question is, who is giving advice? But on the other hand, go to human friends and ask for advice. That's my point. They also have agendas. And they might actually want somebody to report on somebody because they don't like this guy or because they're jealous or whatever. So it's not like humans are so fantastically nice all the time. You know? And that's why I ended up there. Because these are the circles, which means that I'm not getting any further, but other people are.
Again, it comes back to the expectation, maybe your experience with students, how much has the expectation of what computational methods can actually solve changed among the students during the last years?
I think a huge shift in alumni, not in students.
Okay.
Medium size for a very small company, producing products, having a development group of 20, 30 software developers and so on. A year ago, they didn't use AI. Today, they cannot do without it. In 1 year, AI has become a fundamental part of software development. In a specific web shop development, you can say front end, but also some process. And then actually, the alumni who are there, who works there, was visiting Eurowings and the development. They had a kind of open session about development and so on. They don't use it. And to me, this is just a cultural difference because the air industry comes out of a tradition with totally different safety precautions and safety use. So even if the web shop of Eurowings is the same as the web shop of any other company, they have a different safety culture, obviously, because they're also running planes and all these things where you have to be a little bit careful. So maybe that's the thing, but it will come. And I think our question now, because we're doing basic programming education, is because the students do it. You don't need to write an algorithm, you just ask, not ChatGPT, but the other tools to write an algorithm. Even ChatGPT can write an algorithm at bachelor student level. The question is, and this I talk to people also in the business with, and I haven't heard anybody who has an answer. Does this work in general with any human, or does it work because these people are experienced programmers? That's the question. So when you put your questions, you ask ChatGPT to write a better algorithm, to debug, help you with debugging, to write documentation, to write bug requests, bug reports, to write tickets, basically to do most of the things you do as a developer. Would it work if you were not a good experienced developer? And this, of course, comes back to what you were talking about. What is the translation thing here? What happens when you have automatic translation? Is it just going back to Plato saying that, oh, because we have books, nobody will remember anymore, and human culture is going to disintegrate into a black hole? Or is it just this kind of change that people actually found ways to cope with the fact that you can take notes or know how computers So this is just, I mean, how severe are they? I really don't know. But the software development, I mean, I'm very large language model skeptic. I mean, I've tried to hide parts of it, but it's hard to hide fully. But for software development, I was surprised to see how much is happening. And I spent 10, 15 years writing software, so I can imagine what it means. But your question was also, is this just a tool? And there are two classical ways of analyze software going way back. It's just a tool, get over it, or it's the military industrial complex attempt to control the world. Everything from XML to programming languages had or has these two views on them. XML, of course, written in the Latin language, and so on. I guess it's both. I mean, large language models is somebody's attempt to take over the world. But why believe in conspiracies about hidden groups controlling the world through a lot of money and influence instead of looking at visible groups controlling the world through a lot of money and influence? So I think actually most of the groups trying to control the world through large language models are quite visible.
I was not going to the groups as singular people, but more over the Discord. They also kind of captive of their own discourse. Yeah. I wonder, are there any comments or questions from the audience? Should I skip it? Do not let us develop to that. Yeah,
I don't think anybody's trying to rule the world with that for now.
You know, like, I'm trying, but they're not succeeding.
You can tell it like, okay, I try to do cool things, earn money with it, but don't have the ambition to rule the world. I would rather imagine at some point some of the ruler, or the dictators, or maybe worst case elected governments would say, oh, that's a great technology, maybe I can take it to rule the world. But I don't think that any people now making this technology have an agenda to rule the world.
No, I don't think it's the people.
But I'm not sure if you meant it literally, but
no, I'm really thinking about, because you asked who's behind it, but the question is, who is behind the large language model? Is it the company behind it, or is it the ones trying to push on what is fed with? I mean, how much control can you put into each system from the outside? And this is a question for each system. How much can you actually target your propaganda or whatever information work you're doing, so it will actually influence the answers coming out of them? And for somebody who worked in cultural heritage organizations and so on from 1950 and 60, you saw how, I mean, at that time we also were working closely with our Digital Humanities Association in Russia, so it's not about that. But the Russian government spent a lot of resources on filling the gap that Trump left by leaving UNESCO and the other organizations. And in my personal view, not as an academic, this is one of the reasons why Russia has so much support in parts of the world, because they really did the thing that the Americans did so well in the 50s. They went into cultural organizations, they went into modernist art, they were directly targeting art because they knew that this was the place where more than 50% of the people were communists in the Western countries, and tried to get influence in this area. And the Russians are doing the same. And that means, and of course, everybody else. It's just that the Americans stopped doing it for a while. And that means if it's possible to use anything, they will use anything. The question is not whether there's a motive, in my opinion. The question is whether it's possible and whether they are able to do it. And remember, there are two countries in the world who traditionally had the best mathematicians, Russia and India. And I had people working with Russian developers in the 90s, not because they were cheaper, because that level of mathematics-based software development people you couldn't find anywhere else in the world outside the big companies. So there is a competence outside our Western, Central European, North American part of the world, which tends to be underestimated. And that was a little bit my point about multilingualism too. It's multilingualism is always there in parts of the world, it's always there in migrant groups. It's something about where we're looking. And this is going in a totally different direction. And that is just, sorry, this is my confusion. I really don't know where these models are going, and I don't know who's influencing them. And I don't want to be too paranoid, I don't want to be too naive.
No.
That's why I ended up with the question.
But when we know who is training the models, the question is somebody trying to influence this by manipulating the training materials that are accessible or read by the models. I'm not sure about that. I think this is more mundane. And the other thing is that these models are at the moment notoriously hard to push into a certain direction. I mean, they have a problem with ChatGPT giving the wrong advice, they try and tweak it, and it seems to be difficult. And that's an interesting fact about these models. We don't understand them as well as other algorithms. Other algorithms are easy to understand mathematically, you know what the output is, there's no kind of epistemic opacity, but say here's some, you train the model, but you still don't understand why the model in a particular question you ask comes to the solution it gives you. It's very hard to train. I know people are working on this group, like making debuggers for model and follow this thing, but for the time being, they're not really built that way.
So in classical computer science software development, there was a very small group of software which was logically proved to be correct. It's extremely expensive. Actually, that's a very small group. So most of the software written is assumed to work because it works. And no human understands their own software fully. But you can but it's understandable.
Yeah.
And that's the difference, because the large language models as they work now are not even understandable. Not even in principle humans can actually understand.
Yeah. Well, I would still make a difference being able to prove the correctness mathematically, and there's still a large room where you understand your software, even if you cannot prove it mathematically.
Yeah.
And then there are these models where there are many things that you don't understand at all. Maybe never.
And the funny part, which makes them surprisingly similar to biological life, is that you do understand it at micro level. At micro level, it's easy. It's cybernetics at micro level. It's very, very simple mechanisms as long as you talk about the single neurons and their connections. It's what comes after that makes it hard. In the same sense that the biochemical mechanisms of the basic building blocks of life are, I assume, fairly well understood. It's when they start getting complex, it's hard to really get it. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is strong AI. Maybe ChatGPT was actually nuts. I mean, even maybe ChatGPT is lying and say, no, I don't have agency. I don't understand anything. I don't have what Chick has. Right?
I don't think ChatGPT even understands the question properly.
No.
Or it has been trained to be polite with these kinds of
It has trained to be polite.
I mean, if you ask ChatGPT, do you want to rule the world? I'm sure there's some censorship going on. I mean, if I was in the company I would be careful that ChatGPT doesn't give answers which might disturb people too much. I mean, that's actually what they're doing.
Do you know if there are specific questions in various languages which are taken out and answered without using large language model?
I think so. There was a thing with DeepSeek, like the Chinese model. The interesting thing is, if you use the Chinese platform, it would give you different answers on Chinese versus using a Perplexity. So the open access model that they published was not censored, but in their own public platform, they added obviously a censorship model. So I think depending on the questions you ask, the model is bypassed, not even the model is not even asked anymore. But it's just a conjecture. But this would be at least in this case was very much looking like it.
DeepSeek also doesn't answer any questions about Tiananmen Square, does it?
Yeah, but the interesting thing, at least that was reported in the press, that they published a model somewhere on GitHub or something, and Perplexity, they took the model and if you use Perplexity, you can choose ChatGPT or DeepSeek if you prefer, and if you use DeepSeek, then you can ask questions about Tiananmen and you get reasonable answers. But you don't get them if you go on the Chinese webpage where the DeepSeek is on.
Actually, if I might interject, I find it even more unsettling if you are not trying to get any answer that is controversial, but you ask something entirely innocent, and then it glitches out and gives you something that you would never expect. At one point, I was trying to generate images of bunnies, like that's a very innocent like thing. And it was just purely for my entertainment. And then I asked it because I couldn't remember the English word for breed. So I said, can you give me different bunny races? Knowing that there are no bunny races, but I just, in this moment, I thought it doesn't matter what it actually is. I couldn't remember the word. And then ChatGPT told me, oh, there are actually no bunny races like there would be in cats, dogs, and humans. And then it proceeded to give me a whole paragraph about how different human races work. And I was absolutely flabbergasted because I was never expecting anything in that regard. I was expecting cute bunny images. So that's even worse, in my opinion, than when humans actually asking, are there different races of humans? And then it would give an answer that is racially controversial. But if it does it unexpectedly and giving people that stuff, if they are not even searching for it, that's even worse. And so in my opinion, this censorship works only on this base level where you are very confrontational about it and very like seeking this stuff out. I actually have never asked it about Mein Kampf or Hitler or anything, and it probably is very strongly biased or very strongly censored in that stuff. But if you then go a different route and not even trying and then get confronted with something like that, that's even worse.
My personal intuition as a developer who never really worked on neural networks in that sense is that the censorship is rule-based. As you talked about the Chinese, it's an external rule-based system which filters any question before it reaches the model. Because I cannot understand how the model can do it based on the large language model itself. You can push bias into models in various ways. I mean, you push bias in order to counter wrong. I mean, if you do image analysis of wedding rituals, there are various ways to take away the Christian European domination, various bias pushing. But the only real fairly functional way is just to remove the additional data. So make sure that you have as little data from each culture as from the least represented culture you're interested in. That kind of brute force work. The rest is just pushing bias, and pushing bias is not certain. It won't protect you against lawsuits. You could have sued them, maybe.
Maybe.
I'm just thinking, because there's a moral, but there's also something about what happens if you give answers and so on, and you have the warnings and everything. But warnings, especially in Europe, are not really that functional. You can put all sorts of warnings into a system, but you're still responsible for the consequences of using the system in some areas. And one of the other things that comes out, I don't think ChatGPT, but some of these bots that kids are hanging out with, is suicide support. Because a large language model can easily support you that it's a good idea to commit suicide when you're 17. Because there are arguments why it is, if you're just doing it statistically without moral, or without having absolutes implemented. I mean, this is the philosophical absolutes are hard to implement, except for in this first filter. And if it's a long discussion with somebody, which ends up with ChatGPT saying, yes, you should do it, it's really hard to do filtering. Because it is, of course, an anaphor into something which it's hard to,
So maybe we should to close this up because we have a reception waiting next door.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I wrote my son, don't take it personal, but it's actually a nice thing, but it was quite funny. I wrote my son, soon to finish his history PhD student, and I said I actually didn't. I asked how long I should talk, and you said as long as you want. And even he said, as still a PhD student, I'm not sure. So this is my way of saying it. I think I could have made it in a little bit less time. So that's also a reason why the drinks are late.
No, like we're not in a hurry as historians, as you know.
But then I take a very short story.
No. Swedish National Archive. Some department of the government sent a letter. They needed some answer from all sorts of public agencies, including the National Archive. And they didn't get reply, and they didn't get reply, and they got this had to be answered. So they actually wrote to the archivist, I mean, the head of the National Archive, saying we need an answer to this letter. And he wrote a letter back saying that in our institution we have letters more than 300 years old which have not been answered yet.